Hi everybody, I'm Amber Butchart and welcome to Breaking Down Borders, Movement and Migration Through Cloth. This is a conversation and creativity talk for the British Textile Biennial. It's presented by Creative Lancashire, which is a service provided by Lancashire County Council. I am joined this evening by an incredibly esteemed panel of guests. I'm going to introduce them all now. We're going to talk through various aspects of the work that each of them do, and then there will be some time at the end to take questions from the audience as well, if you have any burning questions. So joining us via Zoom, you will be able to see shortly, here we go, is Raisa Kabir. Raisa is an interdisciplinary artist and weaver based in London. She works with woven text and textiles, sound, video and performance to translate and visualise concepts concerning the politics of cloth, labour and embodied geographies. Her work addresses cultural anxieties surrounding nationhood, textile identities and the cultivation of borders, as well as examining the encoded violence in histories of labour in globalised neo-colonial textile production. She has critically engaged with materials such as flax, jute, indigo, cotton and linen production, working with their material properties as well as their potent histories. Professor Alice Kettle, joining us at the end, is a textile and fibre artist, writer and lecturer. Her vast textile panels narrate contemporary events through rich and intricate stitchwork. Her works often use embroidery to engage in participatory collaborative projects, such as her show Thread-Bearing Witness at the Whitworth, Manchester 2018-19, which we'll be talking about shortly, and at the British Textile Biennial in 2019, where stitch was used to examine refugee issues and migration. Alice is Professor of Textile Arts at Manchester School of Art, Manchester Metropolitan University, and she is Visiting Professor at the University of Winchester. Her work is represented in various international public collections, including the Whitworth, the Crafts Council, and the Hanshan Art Museum in Suzhou, China. She has co-authored a number of publications, including Machine Stitch Perspectives, Hand Stitch Perspectives, Collaboration Through Craft, The Erotic Cloth, and Making Stories. Dr. Bharti Parmar is an artist and academic with a practice of 30 years. Bharti studied fine art printmaking at the Royal College of Art, and she has a PhD in material culture studies. She's participated in several international residency programs, and her work is represented in numerous institutional collections, such as the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester and the Government Art Collection. She is co-editor of Colour, Volume 4 of the Bloomsbury Encyclopedia of World Textiles, and serves as an artistic and quality assessor for Arts Council England. She was selected by Dr. Christine Czerkinska, Curator of African and African Diaspora Fashion at the V&A, to exhibit in Maker's Eye, the Crafts Council Gallery's inaugural exhibition celebrating its 50th anniversary, which was on until very recently, until the 9th of October. And we have Dr. Serkan Delice. He's a senior lecturer and research coordinator in the Cultural and Historical Studies Department at London College of Fashion, University for the Arts, London, which does also make him my colleague. His current research explores ways of defining and practicing a transnational ethics of fashion that challenges neoliberal racial capitalism and its systemic appropriation of labour and culture. He is currently working, together with Dr. Anna Marie Almila, on an edited collection covering fashion's transnational inequalities to be published by Routledge in 2022. So an incredibly esteemed panel, as you can see. Now, the themes of this year's British Textile Biennial are the global nature of textiles and the relationships that they create, both historically and today. And the work that all of these panelists produce really speaks to these themes very, very strongly. So I wanted to start with a short video about Raisa's work for her Art in Manufacturing residency with the Festival of Making and the British Textile Biennial in 2019. So this is covering work from 2 years ago. And this introduces these themes very well as ideas around migration perfectly from a personal and professional perspective. So if we could play that video, please.
I grew up surrounded by the architecture and the history steeped in industrial textile heritage, and it didn't take me until maybe going to university or until I was maybe 22 to make the connections that when people talked about East India and they talked about Manchester's cotton heritage, that it was relating to my cultural heritage in Bangladesh, and that was one of the biggest eye-opening moments for me, a kind of watershed moment where I was making connections between 19th century textile mills and the history of Bangladesh and East India. I've spent my career trying to make those connections with the peoples whose history that relates to, underpinning perhaps British textile history as a global textile history narrative. Back in 2019, Festival of Making and the British Textile Biennial were embarking on a co-commission to work with a textile artist to join the 2 sites of Queen Street Mill Textile Museum and a contemporary manufacturer, John Spencer Textiles, both based in Burnley. The beauty of this commission, which I'm so privileged to have worked between these 2 sites, was one steeped in history, one of the original weaving sheds that still stands today with these looms behind me. There are 300 looms here, only a third of what would have been its full capacity, and is the only surviving steam-powered weaving shed in the world. With John Spencer Textiles, Ian Manking, a contemporary textile manufacturer that has changed its apparatus and its mode of manufacturing to include high-end, high-tech manufacturing methods and techniques and equipment to be at the forefront of its industry. And to bring these 2 sites together with my research and my commission work was an absolute joy to create these connections that were spanning through time and history and place, but very much rooted in the textile heritage and industrial heritage of Lancashire. So for the British Textile Biennial, I responded to this amazing, incredible historical site by creating an installation and performance using the equipment and the loom weights. I'm very interested in the manufacture of the apparatus and the steel and the looms and the weights, and I love to build looms in my performances, and I take threads and I use them to build kind of contraptions to comment on the idea of weaving and labour and the histories connected to this site. So I used one of the drawing-in machines. It was incredible to use this antique technology that people describe as non-functional anymore, but is so steeped in history. And I created this loom, using cotton and linen woven through the machine to create an installation. And I used textile waste material from John Spencer Textiles, of which they have reams and reams and reams of selvages, to create this spilling out installation which filled one of the rooms with this cotton textile waste and was woven into this loom that I built. And this was in response to my experience of being in this space and having learnt and read about this history, these narratives. It was a real joy to kind of connect those spaces together, especially one of an historic site and one of contemporary design and manufacture. And my journey into the work that I'm making for British Textile Biennial has to sort of absorb and take these histories that are interrelated and connected to each other to create my own unique design language that references these diasporas and these legacies of migration and globalisation and trade that have been ongoing for many, many, many years. These histories and these locations and these cultures, creating a woven design language, and these are going to be textile archives in themselves.
Now, I love the way that you, Raisa, where you are, talk about a woven design language in this video. Now, 3 of the panelists tonight are artists who work with textiles. Serkan, you're an academic who writes and theorises about cloth. So I wanted to start by asking you all, what do you think is so powerful about the stories that textiles can tell? Let's start with Alice at the end.
Hello, can you hear me? I think Raisa spoke so eloquently. I would say that textiles works through and within cultures. It kind of weaves its narrative within our daily lives. Textiles is ubiquitous, so we all recognize something of its journey, its kind of personal history and its provenance. So it is implicated in our everyday lives. And if we explore that journey, we have an understanding of that complex global narrative. So I think it's powerfully present in weaving, all of these sort of metaphors of textile are present in our language too. So I think that kind of says where it's at in terms of our everyday lives and our kind of concepts of dealing with difficult issues, because it allows us to be present in quite challenging narratives that are about politics and social history, etc.
Lovely. Bharti?
I'm interested in the role of textiles in terms of affect and the body. And I'm thinking of the work of American artist Anne Hamilton, and she says that textiles are the first architecture of the body of the person, the first house of the body. So if you think of when a baby is born and the swaddling cloth, and then when a person dies, and the shroud, the funerary shroud. So textiles and the human body are indivisible, and that's something that I find really, really interesting and powerful and poignant.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you to begin with for the very kind and generous introduction, Amber, and many thanks to Raisa for the beautifully insightful film. German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin describes fashion as a tiger's leap into the past. And I love that description. He tells us that fashion has a flair for the topical, for the present, yet at the same time it's always infatuated with the past. It evokes the past and it brings together the past with the present in the most unexpected ways. And I think studying the history of textiles can also be seen as a tiger's leap into the past. It allows you to hear the voices of all those thousands and hundreds of individuals who were involved in the production and consumption of textiles. And it allows you to seize hold of their memories as they flash up their memories, which for some reason were pushed into oblivion. So I think studying the history of textiles makes us more sensitive to the voices of the subjects of the past. And I also remember a statement made by a Syrian refugee garment worker at this stage, describing the extent of exploitation in the garment factories in Istanbul. He said to a journalist, if, let's say, a machine breaks, they would fix it straight away. But if something happens to a Syrian refugee garment worker, they would throw him away like a piece of cloth. And I think a piece of cloth really reflects the injustices and inequalities persistent in the fashion and textile industries. So that's the reason why textiles are very important for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Raisa, what do you think is so powerful about the stories that textiles can tell?
I think we touch upon the differences perhaps between craft and textiles that evoke culture, that are portals into worlds and histories and languages. And a lot of the work that I do looks at textiles and conflict, where people have had to leave and migrate. And when we have to leave and we can't, we have to leave our land and our homes, the things that come with us are songs, textiles, patterns, food, things that become kind of portals to that world. But also, hand in hand, when we think about industrialized textiles and the kind of the history of industrialization, the differences between kind of technology and kind of multiplying kind of want and need and labor, and the whole host of global narratives around textile production and the human body, it tells also another story of exploitation. I think everyone's kind of touched on that. And I think textiles, for me, are a lens and a prism to talk about the cultural politics of our world today, past, present, and future. And I think they're an incredible tool to get people to start thinking about where these connections take place. And the best thing, as Alice was saying, is that it starts with something with your body and with your home, as Bharti was saying, and it connects us to maybe those stories and those people across worlds where we can't really imagine the kind of conditions that people are working in, or conditions where people had to leave, ideas of partition or occupation. And I think textiles become this kind of unifier that allow us to tell these stories.
Lovely. Thank you, all of you, so much for such thought-out answers to that question. Lovely. If we could go to the next slide, that would be brilliant. Now, Serkan, in your research, you look at fashion production and the European refugee crisis. And in a chapter about this, for the book Fashion and Politics, you write, "The exploitation of cheapened migrant and refugee labour has always been central to the material production of fashion since the late 19th century." So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that with relation to these images, some of which you use in the chapter, and why capitalism is so reliant on the movement of people.
Sure, absolutely. If I can start with a very brief reference to the previous question, I think what I find most fascinating about this history is that indeed, as Raisa was saying, it brings together the past and the present and the future, and the history of textiles allows us almost to have a sense of intimacy and have a sense of solidarity with those who existed before us. And I find it really, really fascinating, and it's a kind of history that we can't be indifferent to, simply because of the fact that when we think about textiles, we are not talking about objects that are detached from us. We touch them, we feel them, we sense them, we are viscerally connected to textiles, and I guess that's the reason why they have this power to stimulate our memory. Now, going back to the production of fashion and textiles, yes, historically speaking, the unregulated, informal, and thus easily disposable labor of immigrant and refugee garment workers has always been central to the production of fashion and textiles. And the reason for this is the magnitude and fickleness of consumer demand. Fashion is unpredictable, it keeps changing, it keeps fluctuating, and the demand is so unpredictable that the industry, to be able to cope with rapid turnover and erratic deadlines, needs flexibility. And this kind of flexibility is really provided by the workshop system, including the sweatshop system, of which I am very critical, but I think undeniably it provides the industry with some flexibility. So here, this is an excerpt from an article which was published back in 1895, and it's about the Russian and Romanian Jews working, in the writer's words, in the vile sweating dance. And the writer tries to answer the question of why these people come to England. They know that England is not a golden land flowing with milk and honey, but they nevertheless come to England, and they, if I can use his words, they toil for a miserable pittance, which is a mockery to call wages. But they nevertheless come to England, and in the end he concludes that, well, they move to England because the Jew can never stay for a prolonged period in one place, and the Jew is always a wanderer on the face of the earth. So from the late 19th century onwards, we see all these racializing, stereotypical representations of Jewish garment workers. And then there's another article which I think is from the year 1902, indeed 1902, and this one is really interesting because in this case actually the writer on the one hand complains that all these Russian and Romanian Jewish garment workers compete with us in our industries. So as you can see, this discourse around, bloody foreigners coming and stealing our jobs has a long history. So on the one hand, he complains that these garment workers compete with us in our industries, and they spread themselves over a district in the East End of London, and they send up the rents. But on the other hand, interestingly, he also acknowledges that these people produce cheaply many articles of necessity, and they make it possible for the English working classes to put on decent, affordable garments. So there is also this acknowledgement. He also tells us that these people work for a wage, which would mean starvation to an English worker. So it's all about this persistent exploitation of cheap labor. And I shouldn't say cheap labor because no labor is cheap. I should say cheapened labor. And I find it interesting. Well, I find it actually horrifying and upsetting in many ways that back in 2014, research conducted by University of Leicester showed that the underpaid wage sum in apparel manufacturing in the East Midlands is £1 million per week. So that shows us the extent of unregulated informal labor and workers basically being underpaid. And today, in 2021, the likelihood of any garment workshop in England receiving an inspection from HMRC is every 19 years due to funding cuts. Wow. So this is persistent exploitation in the industry since at least the 19th century until today, and if one of the reasons is the unpredictable fluctuating consumer demand, another reason is the exploitation of cheapened labor. Mm-hmm. The industry always tries its best to avoid fixed costs associated with heavy, expensive machinery, as well as with settled, established workforce. So the industry is still in the 21st century. The fashion and textile industries are very much characterized by the prevalence of unregulated informal labor.
And we have another slide with some images of some early workshops.
Sure. So in the image on my left, my apologies, I have no sense of navigation. You're seeing employees in a crowded tailoring workshop in the East End of London in 1920s, and then another image where we are seeing women tailors in a tailoring workshop, again in the East End of London. And at this stage, I would like to highlight that at the beginning of the century, workshops, these small workshops where workers were producing ready-to-wear, mostly under dehumanizing conditions. These workshops were the dominant form of organization in the garment industry in this country, with 56% of total employment. They were much more efficient than large factories in terms of the net output per worker, and actually, and this comes from the research of historian Andrew Godley, by the start of the 20th century, these East End Jewish workshops were able to outcompete all factories in England except the factories in Leeds. But even in Leeds, by 1935, small-size workshops, like these workshops, were again much more efficient than factories. And the reason for this is, again, the unpredictability and fickleness of consumer demand. As a result, the industry always tries to avoid fixed costs associated with heavy, expensive machinery in a large factory. So despite the fact that I'm very critical of this workshop system, sweating system, and it's extremely conducive to abuse and exploitation, it does provide the industry with some sort of flexibility, much needed by the industry. And I think this story, this history really tells us how the choices made by a consumer on a daily basis, for example, here in England, make such a huge impact on the lives of workers. For example, in a place like Bangladesh or Istanbul. So in some ways, we are all connected to each other through our garments and through textiles. And I think there's one more image from late 1970s. So this is an image of a boy in a small clothing factory of Brick Lane, again in the East End of London. And not only immigrant labor, but child labor is also very much endemic in the fashion industry. And actually, at the moment, the exploitation of child labor is a hugely serious problem in those under the stairs garment workshops, for example, in Istanbul, where immigrant and refugee garment workers produce ready-to-wear to be sold on the high streets of London and Paris. So again, I think this history shows us actually how we are so connected to each other and how our choices and this history, production conditions are very much intertwined with each other. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll be looking more at your research into workers in Istanbul shortly in the garment industry. But for now, I wanted to turn to Bharti. If we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now, your work for the Textile Biennial this year is called Khadi and is currently on at Blackburn Museum. Now, firstly, we have a short video to introduce it. If we could go to that, and then if we could skip back to that previous slide, that would be brilliant. Thank you. Short teaser there for you to expand on further. If we could go back to the previous one, that would be brilliant. So could you talk us through this piece that's currently on at Blackburn Museum?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Amber. Very short teaser. Could I just have a show of hands? Has anybody seen the exhibition at Blackburn Museum and Art Gallery? So we've got a few hands up, thank you. So as Amber has described, the exhibition at Blackburn Museum and Art Gallery is called KHADI, K-H-A-D-I. And that's been commissioned by British Textile Biennial. And it's about cotton. It's an exhibition about cotton. And KHADI is an important word, and that's the word around which this whole exhibition pivots. It means two things. It means a rough cotton watercolour paper used for art and design purposes. And secondly, KHADI also means a homespun rough Indian cloth. And so the exhibition is in a beautiful gallery, and it comprises three parts. So the first part is bespoke cabinets. So I work in collaboration with other people, with craftspeople, and who can make beautiful things for me. And so there's a collaboration between a cabinet maker who's made two cabinets for me which are illuminated, and they have the vocabulary of sewing or packing industrial tables on which you would examine and fold clothes in sewing factories. And they are illuminated. One is illuminated from the top and one is illuminated from the bottom. And they contain artifacts that either I've made or objects from the museum's collection to do with textile manufacturing processes, and ephemera to do with Gandhi. So Gandhi is important because Mahatma Gandhi was invited to Blackburn, to Darwin, 90 years ago. So this is the anniversary, the 90th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi visiting Blackburn. And I'm going to talk about that at length after I've described this exhibition. So you can see in the bottom slide there that I'm arranging some of the artifacts in the cabinet. So the first thing are the cabinets. The second thing are the punched drawings on the wall, and they are made from KHADI paper. And what's important about this paper is its political content. So all good watercolour paper is 100% cotton rag. And this cotton KHADI paper has been sourced, I've sourced it from an Indian manufacturer, and it's come from recycled t-shirts. And these are t-shirts that were worn on the Western body. So the black t-shirts were black cotton, the black cotton paper were black t-shirts, the white were white t-shirts, and the grey are kind of shades in between. These cotton t-shirts were sent to India to be pulped, to be reconstituted into this fine art quality paper, which comes back to the West for Western consumption. So that's a really interesting global journey. And then thirdly, the third element of this exhibition is a film. And that was that little teaser that I just showed there. And that's a collaboration with award-winning filmmaker who's incidentally from Blackburn. And we have made a really beautiful film which weaves in stories, oral histories of people who knew people who had met Gandhi 90 years ago, places that I'd visited, at the Blue Plaque House in Darwin where Gandhi stayed overnight, the Cotton Famine Road in Rochdale, etc.
Could you just explain a bit about that Cotton Famine
Certainly.
Road?
Yeah, the Cotton Famine Road, also known as the Ruley Moor Road, is in Rochdale. And it's a fascinating place. It's on the moor there, and essentially it's a road that goes nowhere. And it was made because at a different period of time, during the American Civil War, there was a blockade of cotton at the ports, and so that cotton from the plantations, couldn't get to Manchester and the surrounding areas for processing. Therefore, men had no work. And so the Cotton Famine Road is a road in which every cobble tells a story. And so it's a form of social security, a poor relief. So those cobbles were cut and laid by men who had no work. And so I walked the Cotton Famine Road with the trustee of the Roolimore Neighbourhood Forum, and we walked and talked, and it's a really poignant story.
It's an exceptionally powerful symbol, that a road that goes nowhere, that has all of those global connotations. It's remarkable. And if we could just skip forward to Bharti's next, that's it, thank you very much. So as part of, and this is an example of the Caddy paper that we're seeing here, and also one of the cases in the show. So as part of the show, as you mentioned, you recontextualize items, some objects from the museum collections. Could you tell us a bit about some of those?
Yes, certainly. One of the things I'm really interested in is loom cards, and we saw some of those jacquard loom weaving cards in the short film by Raisa, and I'm fascinated by those. Those are an early form of computing, if you like, with the zeros and the ones, the holes. And so I've developed a type of vocabulary, a visual vocabulary, to do with punching and making holes in the paper, and in other artifacts as well. So on the right-hand side, I started making a piece of work using the Caddy paper, not quite knowing really where I was going with it. And it's about mathematics. I'm really interested in vernacular crafts, such as veneering and marquetry, which is about maths, and angles. And what I've done there with a punch is I've made a line and I've moved the punch 10 degrees each time. And so you make a wave, and then it starts to go 10 degrees the other way. And then if you move it along in the next line, you know, you have this really beautiful pattern starting to emerge. And that was incidental, but the title of that piece of work is Warp and Weft. And so one of the artifacts I've looked to is loom cards. The second is the collection of cotton, raw cotton, that the museum holds in its collection. So this is raw cotton fibre in paper wrappers, which has come from either the Indian subcontinent or it's come from the American plantations. And I've made a couple of drawings which use that cotton as inspiration. Firstly, a drawing called Gossypium hirsutum, which is the botanical specimen of cotton, which is long fibre, which was often used in weaving and spinning in the West. And secondly, a drawing called Cotton Plant Morphology. And it's a very simple drawing, very minimal, which you may have seen. And it's, if you understand botany, or it's just simple gardening, you know that if you prune a plant well, it will yield better the next year. And this is a plant, this is a drawing of a cotton plant from a historic manual on how to get maximum yield of cotton plants on slave plantations.
And can you explain a bit about why this fabric, Caddy, cotton cloth, was such an effective means of resisting British colonialism in India and the part that it played within the Swadeshi movement?
Yes. So the Swadeshi movement is the movement to do with home rule and eventually Indian independence. So Swadeshi, you can divide it into two parts. Swa means one's own, and Deshi or Des means country, so one's own country. And Gandhi realized that the way to become independent was to and to harm the British economy was to be self-reliant, and cotton was a product that India produced, and so he said, we will boycott foreign cloth. Indian cotton went to Manchester and to the Lancashire regions to be processed, and that cotton went back to India 40 times dearer. And Gandhi saw this and said, what we will do is we will boycott foreign cloth, we will make our own, and in order to do that, we will make khadi, which is a rough cloth, and we will spin every day. Every person must spin for 1 hour every day. And so in the slide, you can see a small ornament there of the spinning wheel, and that's a small decorative artifact that often Indian houses have as ornaments in their homes, and I certainly grew up with one in my home. And if you look at the flag of India, the contemporary flag, there is a stylized wheel with spokes, and that is a form of the spinning wheel. And so Khadi was a movement, an incredibly important movement to do with the Quit India movement and eventually independence through the work of the hand and the dignity of hand labour. And so in that little teaser, you see constantly my hands, which are certainly well used. And we made a point of that, constantly working and striving and beating and punching holes as a motif throughout the film.
And this process, this movement, had, as you mentioned, direct ramifications here with that visit 90 years ago when Gandhi came to Darwin in 1931. So could you expand on that a bit?
Yes. So Mahatma Gandhi was invited by the mill owners in Darwin in 1931 because they thought they could lobby him because the Indian boycott of foreign cloth was harming East Lancashire industries, and so he came, and in actual fact it was the mill workers who really got behind him, and they cheered and they understood the cause of independence. And so, as I mentioned earlier, my filmmaker and I have been to the house where he stayed overnight in Darwin, a mill worker's house. I think he was ousted, this poor chap who lived in the house, in order for Gandhi to stay there overnight. And apparently Gandhi was quite fussy and he didn't drink cow's milk. He only drank goat's milk. So a goat was procured for him, was tethered to a tree outside the cottage, but that's incidental. But anyway, sorry, I've forgotten your question.
Just to expand.
Yes,
on the
to
trip,
expand. So going back to the important subject of the boycotting of foreign cloth and independence, it was a hugely important visit, and I think what it did is it garnered working people's support for independence and the oppressed.
Lovely, thank you so much. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Now, Alice, the relationship between Britain and India via cotton is something that you have also explored. And similar to Raisa's work that we saw earlier, you're also familiar with using, recontextualizing, and exhibiting in industrial spaces such as mills. So could you please talk us through the Cotton Exchange Material Responses project and the work that you created for it, some of which we can see here?
Yes, thank you, Amber. And actually, it's fascinating to have heard everyone speak, because a lot of this project builds on a lot of those narratives. And I've had to bring my notes with me so that I can give you the wider scope of the project. As you can see, this is Queen's Mill in Burnley, exactly where Raisa was standing. And this is a project that started, it was quite a wide project, which was unpacking all of those narratives which connect Manchester and the wider region of the Northwest with India, with Ahmedabad and Gujarat, through the cotton exchange, where we are implicated in each other's prosperity, social history, and because I work in the art school in Manchester, in a sense, in our design history, the art school was set up very much to provide design for the manufacturing textile industries. So these histories are bound together, they're woven together. And the Cotton Exchange project was, it was conceived as part of the Cultural Olympiad, and it was a really big project to try and sort of see how the kind of challenging histories of exchange were, could be kind of opened up and discussed, and those roots of cotton to be kind of revealed. So it was over some period of years, it was showing the kind of legacy of cotton manufacturer, and it was a series of residency opportunities, both for Indian and UK makers. So there were residencies for Indian makers, Lokesh Ghai, who was in the Blackburn Museum and Art Gallery, and there's a Gujarati weaver, Shamji Vishram Siju, at Platform Museum, Costume Museum in Manchester, and let me just see what else. And then various other ones. There was Liz Riedel at the Whitworth Art Gallery, and then in Manchester at the School of Art, we had a residency program where we actually went over to India and worked both with the Queen's Mill in Burnley and with Rajnagar Mill in Ahmedabad. Both were redundant mills at that time. Queen's Mill is a heritage mill. The one in Ahmedabad, Rajnagar, was completely ruined, but had been there as a kind of relic of the cotton industry. And all of these residencies kind of sought to kind of resume connections, but kind of unpack them with the kind of surrounding narratives. So there were, I was amongst a group of 4 artists working in Queen's Mill. So here you can see on the top left a piece of work that was in Ahmedabad, in Rajnagar Mill, and here on the right, the Queen's Mill. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my work rather than the wider scope of the project. So this was about 2015, so I'm talking about a little while ago. But I remember going into Queen's Mill in Burnley, and it is extraordinary. All of it was run as a cooperative mill, so all of the weavers had to rent their time on the mill, on the looms, and I think it's something like they had to produce 2 yards of woven cloth in a day for it to be economically viable. So it's a very different kind of model of a mill. So I was very interested in the way that they were kind of bound into this economy, that the prosperity of Manchester and the surrounding region was kind of built on this notion of labour. And in a way, it's about these weavers being part of that collective economy, but not really benefiting from it because they were so, the conditions of work were so so hard, were so tough. So here are these are the weaving belts which I've taken off the loom just to show how they were, in a way, their lives were kind of bound into this notion of cloth production. And of course, Lancashire cotton clothed the world. It was the vastness of that economy is really extraordinary. And we see it in the architecture, we see it in the landscape, it's in the sort of arteries of everyone in the region. And it's why we have migration from India and all of the Southeast Asia, it's kind of changed the demographic of both these sense of place, these places. So my project was connecting with around the mill. There are lots of rules and regulations, the conditions that the workers had to work in. So I was very interested in this notion of labour and exploitation. So these are kind of things we've talked about before. And so these loom belts, they have quotes from workers who are working in the Queen Street mill. But then I also commissioned, which you can't see here, are some stitched work from Rubari women who are women in the villages in Gujarat, so surrounding Ahmedabad. I wanted this idea of rules and regulations. What are rules for life? How can we recognize how we work within structures and unpack structures? So this on the left, there are rules written into this panel here. And there are lots of small pieces. And I'm just going to read you some of the rules that these Rubari women stitched. So I had to look them up, I'm sorry, so I'll just find my piece of paper. So the Rubari, they're nomadic people. They were very affected by the earthquake, if you remember, in, I think it was about 2015-16. But they're nomadic people, and they're stitching. There is a matriarchal community where stitching and embroidery is very much how the women, that they become expert in embroidery, and it's part of their kind of economic viability. So it's handed down through generations. So it's a lineage practice. So I commissioned them to use imagery and textiles which would populate some of these loom belts in Burnley Mill, and then some of the quotations would go back from Burnley Mill to the Queen's Mill to Rashnagar. So this is their rules and regulations for life. Rana did a vine that blossomed into a traditional motif. Hariyaban, she did a mango. She said it was sometimes sweet, sometimes sour, and always valued from when it was small, when it is not yet ripe, and when it is ripe. Pratap did butterflies. She said they are free and light and can go anywhere. So those are all the Rubari women. And then, in terms of the workers in the Queen Street Mill, their voices are evocative, and they were passed to me by Margaret Nowak. So there was Oliver Benjamin, a weaver. He said it was very noisy working in the mill. He was there from 1930 to 1948. Mr. Hammer, he had been born deaf and had attended a school for the deaf, where in those days it was traditional to teach them basket making. So he worked in the mill over all his life, and 40, 50 years of work in the Queen Street Mill. And when the textile industry collapsed, he was devastated by the closing of the mill. So there were lots of sort of anecdotes about their memories there. I still gag at the smell of the tape-size room. The gluey thickener from the sides which coated the warp threads to make them smooth and strong. So all of these anecdotes and memories are stitched into these belts. So they're populated by the voices of the workers and the people there. And it was really to encourage this kind of sense of people working in these two sites, and the migration of cotton, and the complex histories and economies that kind of operate between these two nation states.
Thanks so much, Alice. Fantastic. Do we still have Raisa over Zoom?
Yes.
Oh, was that her?
Yeah. Just play my video.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, thanks, Raisa. Now, your current work for the Textile Biennial is a continuation of your art in manufacturing residency at Queen Street Mill, and it's titled Resistances. So could you tell us about it, and can we move on to the next slide as well, please, so we can see an image of it. Could you tell us about it and the textile manufacturers of India, the fabric sample books that you worked with as well, please?
Yeah, so this is a commission that came out primarily of an extended period of research, and I must note that there were a commission at the John Spencer Textiles where I did a jacquard weaving archive. I was very much interested in looking at textile archives and remaking and weaving new archives. So there's a couple of woven textiles in the show. One is made on a jacquard loom at John Spencer Textiles, kind of invoking the jacquard card looms at Queen Street Mill, and created a kind of woven poem incorporating everyone's job role at the factory and invoking those two spaces. Another part of Resistances was a direct kind of response to a particular set of books called The Textile Manufacturers of India, that were created in 1866 by the director of the India Museum, John Forbes Watson, who was from Scotland and had this economic interest in looking at Indian textiles. At this point in 1866, as Bharti was describing, textiles were being manufactured and designed in Manchester in the northwest across lots of different centres of manufacture and being sent back to the Indian market. So these books are a collection of 700 examples from every single part of geography at the time that comprised colonial British India, cut up the textiles that were present and would have been looted and taken by the East India Company, which comprised the India Museum, which then became South Kensington Museum, which now is the Victoria and Albert Museum. These textiles were cut up and put into 18 volumes, and 13 sets of these 18 volumes were distributed nationally around the UK and centres of British design manufacture, with the sole purpose to look at Indigenous textile design of the time, to emulate and make sure that the designs were being copied and would be sellable at that kind of in that kind of marketplace. We see the strategy and the scale of how Indian design or Indigenous textile design was being incorporated in this way to sort of sell textiles back to the Indian market. Particular examples that I've looked at were Sylhet, Kashmir, Dhaka in Bengal, and Calcutta in West Bengal. And these are four sites primarily where partition happened. So after the independence of India, there was the creation of Pakistan, there was the contested site of Kashmir, and Bengal was divided, but also an international border was created around Assam and around the northeastern border of Sylhet. This created a huge refugee crisis and one of the biggest movements of forced displacement, where people had to move along these partition lines. My work invokes the ideas that a lot of these textile heritages from these places on the other side of the borders display similar techniques and similar design languages. There is also a violence in the way that these textiles have been categorized and cut up and put into these books. And as a response to this, I have woven my own kind of woven archive that uses Bengali script and creates a kind of poem, a kind of language of weaving that literally describes the art and language of weaving resistance. And again, looking at the histories of politics of textiles and how the act of kind of weaving certain types of craft, especially in places where it was diminished or completely lost, for example, muslin weaving in Dhaka, or Kashmiri Kani weaving was completely depleted. And these were two sites of weaving cultures and design cultures that were coveted so badly by Britain and Europe and America, and the consumption of perhaps Kashmiri shawls and cotton muslin, and how weaving can be a type of kind of resistance in response to the way that these heritages and these languages and these cultures have been become complicated. That's kind of a little bit about what that piece is about. There is a film that describes the books and goes into historical detail, and there is my weaving, but also the books are present at the Harris Museum in Preston, and they have the full collection there, and I'm hoping to take this piece into the Harris Museum when it reopens and carry on this project and this kind of dialogue between archiving and language and weaving. And it was very important to me to look at the naming of Sylhet and Kashmir, and these are places, because of partition, there's a huge diaspora of people from Bangladesh and Sylhet and Kashmir and Punjab present in Blackburn, in Burnley, where my residency was, and it was really important for me to unarchive these textiles that name these places and sort of bring them out of the museum, as you could say, and put them on display.
Thanks so much, Raisa. And we do have a short video of Raisa looking through some of these textile books. If we could have a look, thank you.
Hand-woven woolen shawls from Kangra, Punjab. These are extremely special. You can see how each block has its own pattern. I'm showing these here because these are from Kashmir, which is a region where we have a huge diaspora of people who left Kashmir after partition, who live here in Burnley and wider parts of East Lancashire. And we can see here that this is the butta or the ambi, or the pattern that people might describe as paisley. It was very interesting to see how the categorization of this pattern is described here as the pine pattern, and how Kashmir is spelt in this way. We would later see how these patterns begin to be replicated in the Scottish town of Paisley, became very highly imitated and highly produced on jacquard machines in the town of Paisley, of which the name overtook the indigenous designs here that you see in this book. These are very beautiful examples. These, as you can see, each colour is done with its own shuttle. So each of these is done like a mini tapestry, and the ground cloth is woven in a twill design, so it's not plain weaves. These are extremely special. It's wonderful to have them preserved here in these books, but also strange that they were collected and cut up in this way. And again we see the words pine pattern.
Thank you, and if we could go to that, yeah, perfect, thanks. So Raisa, you mention in that clip, and you've mentioned already about this, the shawls from Kashmir became incredible status symbols in Europe in the 18th and through into the 19th century. What impact did that have on hand weaving or textile production in South Asia?
So the jacquard loom was introduced primarily to imitate the hand weaving. As I mentioned in the video, they are brocaded, so they are mini tapestries in a shawl. They would have taken months to make. The demand for these shawls was so high, it drove technology and industry to kind of cut corners, and hence the jacquard loom was created, again with the punch card system, the first computer. And it's always interesting to see how kind of technology mirrors or kind of sits along these fault lines of history of how we're trying to compete. The handcraft is something it takes a long, long, long time, and how we value the labour of the person that does it. People were not able to compete in Kashmir with the paisley patterns that were being recreated in the UK, and also Norwich as well. They had their collections as well of creating their own kind of Norwich paisley print type thing. The jacquard loom has floats at the back, so they were a kind of cohabitation. And as we have the access and status symbol of this hand-woven cloth, the access to kind of similar types of cloth were being worn by more working class women in Europe, because they want to kind of emulate the status of these beautiful shawls. It kind of, the popularity of these shawls have waned. But there is a quote that talks about how the veracity of the imitations and the paisley pattern overtaking the kind of indigenous origins of this pattern to the extent that people assume that paisley pattern shawls is indigenous English and British dress. So we can see just how that kind of culture is, that the practice of this does cause harm. And I've talked to students about this, and some of them don't even know that this is where the paisley pattern, or this particular pattern, this particular type of weaving the shawl, because the paisley is present in lots of print in and around India, but this particular technique of the shawl and the kind of the practice of the twill weave that is done on a particular loom by hand and is passed down through generations and is called kani weaving in Kashmir, is nearly non-existent. Unfortunately, it doesn't. People don't pay enough money to have it as a sustained income and economy. There are places where it happens. Those shawls cost thousands of pounds, as they should be, and probably were worth that much back in the 18th and 19th century. I'd just like to say that Kashmir is a place of military occupation, contested borders, where a lot of violence has occurred, and the two things kind of go hand in hand as well. This kind of continued cultural imperialism and loss of this kind of intangible heritage that is passed down from centuries and centuries, and isn't a viable occupation today. And you'll find the woven shawls that are kind of sold in bazaars and things as cashmere shawls are done on machines and are not true brocade anymore. So it's very rare, actually, to find them being practiced today.
Well, that fits in perfectly, actually, with the next question that I wanted to ask. So you've kind of answered it already there, Raisa, but I'm going to bring it to the rest of you. In what ways do we still see legacies of British and European imperialism in the fashion industry? We've seen it here in this, this what would now be termed cultural appropriation of what became the Paisley shawl, and the continuing contested borders and border violence. In what other ways do we see these legacies, Serkan?
Well, I think today's most high street brands and retailers, I would say, are the new masters of colonialism. I think they perpetuate colonial inequalities and injustices from the period of colonialism, in the sense that they don't take any responsibility for the entire supply chain. So today's retailers are retailers without manufacturing, so they don't engage in manufacturing. The industry, when it comes to the production of ready-to-wear, is very much defined by a dominant system of subcontracting and outsourcing. And what this does, this allows retailers not to take any responsibility for the persistent exploitation that goes on in the supply chains. Retailers do engage in regular audits and monitoring, but they are just interested in the first tier of that chain. They really don't pay enough attention to what happens, let's say, in the second and third tiers of the supply chain. And I think this reproduces colonial inequalities in the sense that there is some sort of international division of labor. Here in Western metropolitan cities, we have the privilege to create fashion as meaning and to consume it, and we enjoy the image, we enjoy the icons, and fashion is a source of pleasure. It's very much associated with glamour. But actually, the production of most fashion items and objects takes place outside of the West, and often under the most dehumanizing and dodgy conditions. And I think this is a legacy of colonialism, the system of subcontracting, outsourcing, and not taking any responsibility for the supply chain. So I think this is one of the ways in which we are still seeing the living legacies of colonialism. And I think it's not a coincidence that some historians call the 19th century the long 19th century, because in the 21st century, unfortunately, we are still dealing with the legacies of colonialism.
Thank you. Bharti?
Yes, another legacy of colonialism is body image. And as an Indian woman, I'm very alert to Indian women and girls in the Indian subcontinent and their understandings of the ideal shape and the ideal skin tone and skin lightening, and hence the burgeoning of skin preparations in order to lighten one's skin, not just in India, but in Africa and in this country as well. So I think there's something to reflect on there to do with what is considered ideal as a remnant of colonialism.
Absolutely. Thank you. Alice?
It's such an enormous question, isn't it? So I'm going to answer it in terms of where I work, which is in a school of art. And of course, one of the things we have to do is decolonize the curriculum. We need to unpack everything. And that means in terms of all our reference points, all the way we think about the way we teach, the way we source, we resource things, the way we understand the kind of origination of imagery, and the way we describe it, the way we think about what we think is, what we value in terms of Western-centric cultures. So it's a massive thing to do, but it's work that we have to keep chipping away at and constantly negotiating as part of removing the kind of the Western-centric narrative.
Thank you very much. Lovely. Can we go to the next slide, please? And we might need to start speeding up the final couple of answers a little bit, just a warning. Now, Serkan, these images are from your writing about Syrian refugees working in the garment industry in Turkey. Now, in your writing on this, you begin by recounting Anna Wintour, from American Vogue. I'm sure you've all heard of Anna Wintour. In a TV appearance in 2016. Now, she was describing Kanye West's latest collection, and she called it migrant chic. Now, this understandably garnered a huge backlash, and she responded by saying, "I apologize if my remark was offensive in any way. The migrant crisis is real, and I didn't intend to trivialize that issue." So I was wondering if you could talk firstly about these images and your research in this area, but also about the way that in your writing you actually invert this notion of migrant chic to have a much more hopeful meaning.
Sure, absolutely. So there are again, long-standing, persistent stereotypes reproduced again and again in different periods in relation to garment work. And I'll relate this to that phrase that Anna Wintour used, migrant chic, and I think she perhaps quite inadvertently did give me some inspiration. So there are long-standing stereotypes. I think one of those stereotypes, for example, is this notion, this myth of nimble fingers. So women have nimble fingers. That's why garment work, sewing, is more appropriate for them. And today, when we are talking about the sweatshop system, the sweating system, which is very much characterized by excessive work, drudgery, and extremely long hours, extremely exhausting work, I think it's important to remember that this sweating system first proliferated on the backs of women workers, for example, in this country back in the 19th century, and then the system intensified in the late 19th century, especially between 1881 and 1886, when Russian and Polish Jewish migrants fleeing the pogroms started to move to England and played a hugely influential role in the production of ready-to-wear in workshops. And I find it interesting that the fact that actually some of those Jewish garment workers had been tailors back in their homelands was never acknowledged. Now, this is exactly what's happening in contemporary Turkey. So after the Syrian civil, well, I shouldn't say after, because it's still continuing, unfortunately. So a significant number of Syrian refugee garment workers today produce ready-to-wear to be sold on the high streets of Western metropolitan cities. And I find it really intriguing that the fact that some of these garment workers actually had been working as tailors back in Syria is never being acknowledged. So the industry is very much, again, characterized by this constant degradation of skills, demotion of skills. And then if you look at Turkish newspapers, you can see how Syrian refugees are represented as ungrateful benefit scroungers, right? Or sometimes they are depicted as greedy entrepreneurs. And I think all these stereotypes are long-standing stereotypes, but actually what these stereotypes hide is the simple fact that the booming garment industry in Turkey very much relies on the cheapened labor of Syrian refugee garment workers. And actually a CEO that I spoke to when I was doing my field work told me, had it not been for the Syrians, our shelves would have remained empty. Because this kind of work, which is extremely demanding, exhausting, and draining, is increasingly not preferred by Turkish workers. So again, it is outsourced. But there is this myth that this kind of work doesn't require sophisticated skills. And we see exactly the same myth back in the 19th century in England, right? So Jewish garment workers, they come and work in the garment industry simply because the garment industry doesn't require intricate, advanced, sophisticated, refined skills. And there's still this idea today in the 21st century, but actually not last summer, but the summer before, I did have the opportunity to spend some time as part of my field work in an under the stairs garment workshop, which I should call a sweatshop, and actually I worked there, and it does require extremely sophisticated skills, because skill in this context is very much associated with speed and accuracy. And people start working at 7 a.m. in the morning, mostly finish at 9 p.m. in the evening, with very short breaks. It's drudgery, it's repetitive work, it's extremely demanding work, and that kind of work does require advanced skills. So I think the first thing we should do perhaps is to challenge this myth that garment work in the context of a workshop or a CMT, cut, make, trim operation doesn't require high skills. It does. Now, going back to Anna Winter, yes, whilst talking about a collection created by Kanye West, she characterized that collection as migrant chic, and yes, I would say it was a slightly, well, perhaps not slightly, perhaps quite offensive term to use, and indeed later she apologized. Now, fashion loves the spectacle, and it is fashion very much means this ever-increasing speed. This has been the case since at least the 19th century. Again, it's all about this perpetual quest for novelty and originality. So what fashion does, it absorbs all differences, racial differences, ethnic differences, religious differences, appropriates them in order to generate profit. And this has to do with that sheer speed, ever-increasing speed. And I think that phrase migrant chic is very much about that fashion spectacle absorbing even the most sensitive aspects of human experience. Having said that, I think what I find really interesting is that at the end of the day, there's absolutely no reason why the experience of immigration and the desire, the understandable desire to be chic, should be incompatible with each other. And what I mean by this is that yes, especially forced immigration is a traumatizing experience for people, but at the end of the day, immigrants do exist, right? And immigration does happen, and immigrants, like all other human beings, they have their competencies, they have their creative aspirations.
Hello?
They have their skills, and I think it is really important to appreciate those skills, to understand that these people, immigrants, are not empty surfaces. They have a history, they have a background. And I think this is the reason why I believe that fashion production on all its levels should be a creative process. I believe, and this might be a vacuous belief, but I believe that every human being has a perception, experience, and taste of fashion. So I think we should try and create a world which not only accommodates immigrants, but also a world in which immigrants can thrive, an accommodating world and a supportive world where, in the end, the experience of being an immigrant and the desire to engage with the chic shouldn't be incompatible with each other, because everyone is entitled to fashion, everyone has the right and indeed desire to be fashionable. So just to wrap up, I think fashion production on all its levels should be a creative process, and the existence of immigrants shows us the artificiality of borders, right? They pass the borders, which should show us that actually those borders are artificial, they are constructed. And likewise, there are borders in the world of fashion between those who produce fashion as meaning, as an idea, designers, stylists, and those who produce fashion as objects, unfortunately, under bleak conditions. So I think we should challenge that hierarchical division of labor, and we should try to create spaces of production where people can actually produce fashion also as meaning, where people can be creative, where people's skills and creative aspirations and competencies are acknowledged, where people are treated not only as workers, but also as individuals with a taste of fashion, with a desire for fashion, which I think is inherent. So I think it is time for us to challenge the borders of fashion. And I think that's actually what Anna Wintour, perhaps again inadvertently, did when she used the term migrant chic. There is absolutely no reason why there should be borders between the experience of immigrants and fashion. Fashion should be affordable, available, accessible, and its production should be a creative process. It should enable the flourishing of our capacities. And we are all creative beings. All human beings are creative. So I think fashion production should really allow individuals to develop, to enhance their capacities and also their intimacy with the fashion object. And I think, going back to what I said at the very start, a piece of cloth is never just a piece of cloth. We are all emotionally, viscerally connected to our garments. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why we can build up solidarities across the borders on the basis of that shared intimacy, by remembering that we are all connected to each other, and our garments are being produced somewhere by some garment workers. And I think it is really important to remember that we are connected to that person, right? And that person actually is a part of our lives. So connectedness, I would say. I think that idea of migrant chic really communicates the importance of connectedness and the importance of challenging that hierarchical division of labor in the fashion and textile industries.
Thank you very much. An awful lot to think about there, really a lot of rumination. If we could have the next slide, please. So finally, before I open up to the audience for questions, Alice, I wanted to come back to you. Now, these themes of migration that we've heard about, these come through incredibly strongly in your work, Thread Bearing Witness, where you worked with various displaced groups of people, from child refugees to asylum seekers. So could you just tell us about this work, please?
Yes, thank you, Amber. Well, some of you may have seen it because it was in the Gawthorpe Barn at the last biennial. And it was, you know, I am implicated in textile making and all those narratives. And so when this kind of proliferation of people movement started to occur around 2014-15, I felt an obligation, a responsibility to kind of use the one place where I feel I have a voice to acknowledge or make some kind of statement about what I saw was happening. So this project was to show solidarity, all the things that Serkan's been talking about, to kind of have a vision of a world without borders, which was a shared world, but to acknowledge human dignity of individuals, but in a messy kind of world where people are in movement, and to use textiles to demonstrate that, because as we've heard, textiles can move, can migrate where people can't. So this is just one piece. You know, I have to say this project turned me inside out and upside down, and the ethics has been deeply, deeply challenging, but why wouldn't it be? And so the idea was that it was a universal site, the world, that we are all a part of, and we have to negotiate that. So this piece you see here is one of 3, which are these huge panels which represent different universal sites. So this is ground, and it's accompanied by sea and sky. And outside of this are many, many kind of connected projects which go on, they continue. And essentially it was about making a kind of chronicle, being witness to this this period of time of people in displaced through conflict, through no desire of their own to move, but to acknowledge that they are part of this shared world. So this is a piece where they contributed imagery to be part of this huge textile project. And outside of that, it was is in a very small way trying to do what you were describing, to try and acknowledge that there is value in that voice and find how to place it in the world and how to sustain it and move it forward. So I have various other connected projects going on where I am trying to support and sustain those individuals or groups who've participated. Obviously that's in a very limited way, and you can see there is one person stitching there, and it was to say, however small your contribution, it has a resonance to it of value. You know, it is a gift into this kind of utopian vision of a shared world, and textiles is a really good way to represent that because it comes with all of those associated narratives and implications. So I think that's a way of just describing a very kind of big project.
Thanks so much, Alice. Fantastic. Okay, we do have a few minutes for any questions that you might have. So does anybody have any questions for any of the panelists, including Raisa on Zoom?
It was a very interesting talk, actually. My mind's actually spinning with ideas, so I thank you. I just want to comment on the Cardi exhibition that was in Blackburn Museum, and giving your comments. And it's kind of roundabout ways that I just want to say that not all of the workers supported Gandhi when he visited Darwin, and you don't see the people who boycotted that visit in the photographs. So, which sort of touches on this, the politics of the industry, the textile industry, that grew out of places like Blackburn and Manchester and the mills surrounding Manchester. Which would also address some of the issues that we're seeing in the sweatshops. How does that still exist? We had union movements, we had political movements that improved working conditions, but somehow that doesn't seem to have stuck. It's still that these conditions are still existing. But that's actually, put that aside a bit, because my real question is to you as artists and academics and fashion designers, and I'm not any of those, is presenting your work, for example, the video in Blackburn Museum. You have a platform, it's so subjective, so evocative and challenging. Some would say biased. How do you teach, or how are you taught in your disciplines? When does that art, which is sort of to be celebrated because you have a unique voice, you have that perspective, when does that cross into propaganda? How do you distinguish? Because, as you say, with this comment of, when does migrant chic become acceptable? For somebody to say that, somebody with such power makes that mistake, that this is actually something. No, that is a kind of an idea that, certain people in power, the fashion industry, the artists, a lot of people in the textile industry, you are given that platform. How do you balance that? You say, well, wait a minute, yes, I know I've got these views and I've got this perspective and my history, but, maybe I should hold back a bit because the audience I'm presenting it to might not have that same perspective. How do you balance it? How are you taught to do that? Because it's, I understand it's, the purpose of this exhibition or this biennial is to have different perspectives, to challenge our perceptions, but there's also a bias in that. That's what I'm trying to get to, is how do you manage that? How do you know when to...
Well, I will comment briefly on the Khadi exhibition, which is the first point you raise, and perhaps then we can go to migrant chic. Yeah, I take your point. Not everybody agreed with Gandhi's stance. That's also a fact. The mill owners certainly didn't. I think our jobs as artists is to, we're mirrors, we reflect what we see and what's going on in the world, and it is subjective, but also I've made a really valid attempt to be historically accurate. So a lot of the research was in the archives, working with the archivist, looking at newspaper cuttings of that period, a lot of research to do with Gandhi's visit when he came here. The drawings of plant morphology are to do with scientific record and plant yield. So, of course, there are subjectivities, and there are two sides. But we do our best as artists. In terms of education, maybe I can pass that on to you, Serkan.
It is difficult indeed. I think with the migrant chic, it is needless to say, it's absolutely fundamental to be sensitive to the plight, trials, and tribulations of immigrants. It is a traumatizing experience. I do appreciate that. Not only do I appreciate it, I do feel it to some extent. But also I think it is important not to victimize people. And I think that's one of the reasons why I find that idea, that notion of migrant chic interesting, because I think there is some sort of implicit appreciation of the fact that these people are not just victims, that they have their creative aspirations, that they can be innovative, and that they can have a taste of fashion. And I think this also has to do with the question of who has the power and privilege to be fashionable? Why are we living in a world where immigrants are excluded from the space of fashion? Why are we living in a world where fashion is seen as some sort of luxury, right? Because I think it's a very basic human right. It should be affordable. It should be accessible. That's the reason why I find it interesting, that phrase. But going back to your question, when it comes to teaching, I keep asking questions, and I always advise my students to be sensitive to what they are looking at, what they are analyzing, what they are trying to understand. It can be an image, it can be a human being. So hear people's voices and be sensitive to those voices, and try your best not to impose yourself on them. Having said that, perhaps as a lecturer, I do impose myself on my students on a regular basis, but I'm trying my best to be as self-conscious as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, I think, if anybody has a question they would like to ask.
Thank you. To kind of quote Serkan, if a piece of cloth is just never a piece of cloth, and there's been many of us in the industry and educators as well who've been making that point for quite some time. And now that we're on the verge of COP26 as well, where there's actually a real call out and a real need for real action in terms of government, in terms of more direction, sort of, I guess, for term. You know, to what degree do you think it's an issue that we now have to look at in the same way that we address issues like climate action? It's part of this circular economy kind of conversation, but it seems that people seem to have an acceptance, you know, that the cost is worth it in terms of its cost to humankind and in terms of our values and that exchange.
I think we urgently need to slow down. The industry needs to slow down, but then I think it is difficult because what happened during the pandemic, we had to slow down. But as a result, thousands of garment workers in Bangladesh, for example, lost their jobs. So when we slow down, it automatically makes an impact on the livelihoods of people producing those garments. Nevertheless, I would say we need to slow down, and I think we need to create spaces of production where slow production happens, places independent of or from drudgery, repetitive, exhausting, draining work, where actually people can appreciate a piece of cloth and can accomplish their creative capacities by using that piece of cloth. So I think we urgently need to slow down, and I was reading this New York Times article, I think, back in July, and it was about how the clothes that we donate to second-hand shops with the best intentions to charity shops sometimes actually end up in massive dumps, landfills in Ghana, for example. And there was this picture of 2 cows swamped in a huge pile of clothes in a landfill. So even this system of donation and charity in some ways is a system of which we should be critical. But yes, I think it's the amount of clothing that goes to the landfill on a yearly basis is huge. It's just unacceptable. I don't think we can afford it at this point in the history of our civilization, given the climate emergency. So I think we need to slow down. We need to create methods, opportunities of local production and manufacturing, but also I think we need to create a system that also makes it possible for people not to lose their jobs, because people are reliant on their jobs. And to be honest, I don't know how to do this, and I don't know how to achieve this, but I guess it is the responsibility of politicians to come up with solutions. But thank you.
Does anybody else want to tackle climate change?
Well, I think it's a given that we have no choice, and of course textiles is one of the sort of main contributors to that. You know, I can't give you any statistics, but at every level, the production, use of water, the disposal. So we have no choice, and I think this is so. A lot of our students are looking at kind of more sustainable ways of producing, of dyeing, and you know, obviously that's the impact of that is going to be not happen quickly. But I think there is a desire and a need to rethink how we wear things, how we use things, how we retain things. But obviously that has big implications, and as you say, it's a kind of governmental, it's policy, global initiatives that will change things more radically. But I think we can do things on an individual level, and I think it's all about localism. And, coming back home, during the pandemic, everyone was making things at home, weren't they? Lots of people knitting and sewing. And in a way, we need to harness all of those initiatives for in order to mitigate against climate change. We need to do that urgently. There's no question.
I've got a quick question, if that's all right. You're talking about the fact you've just brought up about the pandemic and it went back to people making their own clothing. I did my degree in home economics, and we were taught in school in the 1970s how to do dressmaking, how to cook. All that's gone now. And that's a government thing that it's stopped. And you've got so many changes in fashion that children and younger people are going to the likes of Parmar and buying something to go out and wear once. Whereas when I was brought up, my mum made my clothes, and you were taught how to sew and do dressmaking, and all that's gone. So the students that you're getting, where have they got their skills to do pattern drafting and dressmaking and things like that?
Well, you're talking to someone who believes that if everyone could stitch, it would transform the whole world. So yes, I agree. We should all be making things and doing things, because I think on every level, mind, body and soul, we would, all the politicians would stop arguing if we all started stitching. So yeah, I think and the way that it has been dismantled in education, it should be back in there, because it's all about all those other integrated subjects. And creativity is about thinking about solutions. It's about solving climate change through being practical and pragmatic and understanding about materiality. So it's a kind of essential prerequisite to everything you do, I would say. Yeah.
What I would also add is that we had discussions around this very issue earlier today in another Conversations in Creativity event, which you can find being streamed shortly on the Super Slow Way YouTube account if you're interested in finding out more. There were a number of designers speaking and academics talking about the circular economy, talking about waste management systems. Dr. Pami Sinha from the University of Leeds, who's making real headway in these areas. And also we had Justine Aldersey-Williams, who's behind the Homegrown Homespun project in collaboration with the British Textile Biennial. Some of you may have seen there's also an exhibition about that on at Blackburn Museum, but they have been growing flax and woad. It was just recently harvested. The idea is to grow a pair of linen jeans. And ideally, with what they learn, they can then scale up production to have this real sort of field to fabric to fashion process, this regenerative system that it actually also sequesters carbon as well. So it's actually the process of production itself helps climate change, as well as it not being extractive and using fossil fuels. Very interesting project covering these different areas, and looks at ways that communities, maybe outside of government inaction, which is what we're totally seeing at the moment, can start to think about these things, think about these areas. So thank you very much for those questions. Now that only leads me to say thank you so much to these fantastic panellists, Raisa on Zoom, if she's still around, Alice, Bharti and Serkan. Alice currently has 2 exhibitions of her work open at the moment, Threadbearing Witness at the Rural Life Museum Glastonbury until the end of October, and also Threadbound at the Candida Stevens Gallery in Chichester until the end of November. Raisa's Resistances exhibition for the British Textile Biennial is on until the end of the month at Queen Street Mill, and Bharti's show Caddy is on at Blackburn Museum until the 18th of December. You can also catch my show, Cloth Cultures, at the Haworth Art Gallery in Accrington, which is also on for the rest of the month. And I created a Cloth Cultures podcast, related podcast, that features a whole range of different voices in it, which also includes Bharti and Raisa as interviewees as well. And you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. We have a few more conversations in creativity coming up. 2 tomorrow, focusing on denim and protest, looking at things from the civil rights movement in the 1960s through to the Black Lives Matter protests of very recently. Also one later in the day on power, politics and production, the global impact of denim. And finally, on Thursday, we have an online event, Cloth Connections, Colonial Impacts on Material Cultures of the African Diaspora. And that is created and hosted by another of our colleagues, Talika Kirkland, at London College of Fashion, and also she is the founder of the Costume Institute of the African Diaspora. So do check out all of those. Thank you so much for coming and for sticking with us. Thank you.